exactly. Yeah, today we have an interesting talk. Well, we always have interesting talks, come on. The interesting part is ethics. If you open up Twitter, you see that everyone is talking about ethics. And I think 99.99% of those people don't know what they're talking about. They just talk about ethics because we, the leaders, don't know what ethics is and we believe them. But Brad Baker today, who is presenting, actually knows what he's talking about because he has a minor in philosophy, major in mathematics from his undergrad. So it's speech. Oh, major in philosophy. Wow. Okay, I didn't know. I thought you were like
It's like a little weird in college, but yeah. Let's get into it. I think everyone will agree that the questions of, what does it mean to use AI ethically in general is very salient right now. Like Sergey has said, it's being talked about a lot with a lot of the, controversies that are happening with big companies being involved. There's a lot of money involved. There's a lot of human, like individuals involved. There's like a lot of stakeholders that are all kind of asking these questions. And I think it makes sense. I don't know if I think that people don't know what they're talking about so much, but I think that people are, talking about different things, and some people just aren't thinking about it rigorously as well. And so I think it's useful to kind of think about some of the salient questions that come up in ethics that are relevant for AI and in particular for our work for neuroimaging. So the kind of the plan here will be to go, over some general ideas that come up in, the philosophy of ethics. I'll talk about some ethical frameworks that have sort of historically been talked about. The point is not to be prescriptive. I'm not like trying to tell you, do this with your models. That is the right thing, or that is the wrong thing. I'm not trying to be sort of your teacher here in terms of like morality. I'm not, telling you you're doing things wrong or right. But the idea is just to like start us thinking about, okay, how can I build the like an internal ethical framework, or how can we as scientists build ethical frameworks to do things that are useful and not harming people and that kind of thing. Let's jump into it. So why is ethics important? We've kind of talked a little bit about it. So ethics, I think, can be best understood as what's called a normative framework in philosophy. We talk about this. So you talk about, what I ought to do is how I best heard it described. So it's not sort of what can I do? That's a different question. That's a question of maybe physics and biology, that kind of thing. But what I ought to do in a given situation. So what is right or wrong, and is how we describe it in most disciplines. So it's extremely salient in medicine. I mean, throughout the history of medicine, ethics has been intrinsically tied. You have the Hippocratic Oath, even back to the ancient Greeks. You have people that are, resolving to, not cause people undue bodily harm and these kinds of things. And the idea is that we want to, make sure that when we are, you know, um, bringing people into, by definition, vulnerable situations, that we are, making sure that we are, making the best decisions that for those people, and of course for ourselves and for the field in general. I think thinking about ethics is extremely important for, not only improving patient outcomes. People tend to respond better when they feel that they are being cared for, or care is, an overloaded term, but when they know that there's some ethical principle guiding the work that you're doing, generally you'll see better response in the clients you're working with, the patients you're working with, that kind of thing. And of course, we want to foster trust and confidence with the people that we're working with. If we, are not thinking about the ethical implications of our work, and something happens which causes something horrible to, horribly affect a lot of people, we suddenly have violated the trust of our patient population, and we're not going to be able to, create, significant impacts with our work anymore. And so people are not going. We're already seeing it. The people are not trusting AI for a lot of things, and for good reason, and some for not good reason. Some, they see some scary thing, and they all of a sudden think that all applications of machine learning are scary, and it's maybe not the case. And of course, just the fact that AI is a new technology, that's why people are, grasping so much with these questions, and are really struggling to, ask, how do I think about what is right and wrong in the context of artificial intelligence? So, let's get into it. So we're going to go over a few different sort of broad ethical frameworks that have appeared in the history of philosophy and ethics. You might sort of recognize some of these names, and you might recognize some of the mechanisms that these frameworks use for how you think about, what is right and wrong, and that kind of thing. So let's dive into it. So utilitarianism, a field famous among the philosophers, John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, that kind of thing. Jeremy Bentham's famous for the panopticon, this really scary prison concept that I like to read a lot about. But the idea is that the right action, the most ethical action, is the one that that produces the best overall consequences. It's a kind of consequentialist ethical framework. So you're not thinking about what you're doing necessarily so much as what outcomes it produces. So the term ends justify the means is often associated with utilitarianism for that reason, but it's not only associated with utilitarianism. The idea is that you're somehow measuring the consequences in terms of pain, sadness, happiness, pleasure, that kind of thing. It's a very straightforward way of thinking about right and wrong to some extent, right? You're like, okay, I want to minimize harm, whatever that means. And that's the kind of the sticking point for a lot of utilitarian ethics, is that there's not really a clear definition of what harm might mean in a different contexts. So you have like, okay, is it that I want to minimize pain? Of course, pain thresholds will be different between people. Pain is often self-reported, and you don't always know if one person describes pain, they might be extremely tolerant to that kind of thing. So there's this measuring problem in utilitarianism that often comes up as a criticism. It's also extremely difficult to predict what the outcome of your actions will actually be. So, although I might work and take actions to sort of, okay, yes, I'm trying to minimize the harm by doing X, Y, Z, I don't know if my X, Y, Z will actually lead to that minimizing harm outcome. So, you might do the best that you do, but you're difficult to actually see what actual harms may occur. And often in utilitarianism, another large criticism that you'll see is that once you start integrating multiple people into societies and populations and that kind of thing, you have this calculus of harm and groups of people, and you can say like, so the maximizing benefit and minimizing harm, you can maximize that just by benefiting the majority of people. And who cares about your minority population? It's a huge, huge problem, of course. I mean, you can't just ignore your minority populations and say like it doesn't matter if you have some amount of harm caused to you because the greater amount of my population is benefiting. Of course, that's where you deal with huge societal problems like racism and things like that are affecting minorities and stuff like that. So some criticisms that are leveled against utilitarianism. However, it's still very popular. And a lot of what utilitarianism is doing these days in ethics is people are trying to sort of address these criticisms. Okay, how do I come up with a useful calculus of harm and a useful calculus of pain and whatever? And there are a lot of people doing interesting stuff with it in animal rights and in AI as well. So that's just a broad field there. Any questions about utilitarianism? I think it's very widely understood. But before we move on.
There's also a counter, kind of a cartoonish example. I forgot, it's something monster, that if there is a creature or like an idol for society for which just a little suffering is so much more valuable than any of our suffering, and a little bit of pleasure is so like we will be just like praying to that monster and like not doing anything.
Right. There's also a question of so when have sort of combined harms from individuals in this thing, you come up with this very elaborate calculus of consequences. Who is the person who is doing that, right? What is their vested interest in coming up with a particular way of measuring things? So it's a very important question to ask of a lot of utilitarian philosophies. So who is determining that measure? Because a lot of times you'll have people in power are the ones determining it, and they will have a vested interest in preserving and maximizing their own self-interest and that kind of thing. Okay, so deontology, a big name for I think a straightforward idea, but the idea is that it's attributed to a very famous philosopher, Immanuel Kant, and a couple other philosophers have variants on deontology. But the basic idea is that it's most important when you make ethical decisions to adhere to a particular set of duties or some kind of moral code. It doesn't matter if your actions don't produce the outcome that you expected. It doesn't matter if they cause more harm than you expect, because you can't control that because the world is complicated. What's more important is that you have some moral code. And some things are absolutely wrong to do. Killing people is absolutely wrong to do. The Ten Commandments is often seen as like a list of, moral codes that people adhere to in their deontological framework. And the idea is it's just most important to adhere to that as much as possible.
Or Constitution.
Yeah, or the Constitution. Yeah, yeah. And everything else goes aside. So, Immanuel Kant, Thomas Nagel, some prominent philosophers who deal with this. And there are some concerns with this as well. So the big sort of boogeyman concern you see against deontology is that during the Nuremberg trials following World War II, you had a lot of prominent, Nazi officials who used deontological arguments to justify, very horrific actions that were taken, in concentration camps and that kind of thing. And their arguments were, well, it was my duty. I was just following my duty. I was doing what I was told to do. It's my duty to, otherwise society would go into chaos if privates stopped obeying their officers and that kind of thing. And so that's the kind of the boogeyman argument. People think that's a simplification and a misunderstanding often of what Kant was saying, of course, because that you have conflict between that and the absolute, do not kill sort of frequent duty or list of moral rules. But yes, you can have sort of these adherence to rules and adherence to duty, but create horrific consequences. It's built into the framework. You're not thinking about harm. And so the utilitarians will ask, and the consequentialists will ask, well, where does that fit into your calculus? Why are you not considering the potential of your actions when you are, writing your code of ethics? There's also, of course, I just mentioned the disagreement between, rules and principles. They are often contradictory, and they are often, again, they suffer the same problem of who is responsible for coming up with this list, and what is their vested interest in deciding, what sort of is this best list of moral rules that humanity ought to follow in order to create the best society or whatever, or just because it's universally correct, which is what Kant thought. So yeah, there's a lot of criticisms to levy against deontology as well, but it still is very popular. A lot of people do believe, there are some things you just don't do, and it's just because you don't do them. There are rules, there are lines you don't cross. Is kind of the way that you could think of deontology. What's up?
Sorry, I have a question. So, sorry, I'm a huge critic of Kant.
Sure.
What are some examples of deontology in modern society? I can't think of any.
Again, adherence to duty is still very. I mean, you see it in police forces. You see it in. You even see it in.
But the Constitution, come on. The U.S. is built on that principle.
In the military too. Everyone in the military is always just, I'll do what my boss tells me to do.
Oh no, but military would be able to function if this wasn't true.
Yeah. Well, and that's the argument for that deontology just uses. It keeps like these structures intact. You're preventing chaos.
And how can so not to mind Kant this thing, but how can you have ethics without free will? Then if we're all supposed to follow orders, then how is there no sense of ethics?
Well, I'm not following the bringing into free will here, because Kant, your free will is, doesn't really play into the equation here. I have free will to adhere to my duty. It's just that Kant is saying that it's the right thing to do. The thing you ought to do is to follow that duty, right? It doesn't matter whether or not you're free to do it, or you're some bundle of chemicals that is, if you're some bundle of chemicals that just follows your duty, then the entire question of ethics goes out the window entirely. So I'm going to sort of shove that to the side and assume that for practical purposes, we as humans act as if we have free will, and we are choosing to make our decisions, and I am choosing to do what I think is right and what I think is wrong. Of course, if I'm just a bundle of chemicals that is coming up with that, argument in my head, then whatever, then it's all. But we act as if we have free will. So let's, I think, move on with that. Okay, more stuff about deontology. Any other questions about sort of duty-based ethics and that kind of thing? All right. Another framework called virtue ethics is focused more on building positive character traits. And the idea is you have to ask yourself, what kind of person ought I be, rather than what actions ought I take? You're thinking of your person and the traits of your personhood that then inform your actions. So, of course, once you determine that I am a virtuous person, I am an honest person, I am a fair person, that kind of thing, the actions it is assumed will follow. Of course, there are some arguments there. This has come from folks like Aristotle. Martha Nussbaum is a modern writer who actually writes a little bit about data ethics and stuff from a virtue ethics standpoint. She used some interesting papers. But this virtue ethics can suffer from a lot of the same problems that some of the other frameworks have had. You have conflicts between virtues. Again, who is determining what a virtue is? You have this GIF from Gladiator, where the emperor's son is like, "Dad, you say I don't have all these virtues, but I have actually this, and that virtue. I'm, a strong military leader. I'm a, this and that thing." So it's really like you're still having to come up with what counts as a virtuous character trait for a person to have. And again, even if you determine like I should be this kind of person, I should be honest, I should be that. There's not always a connection between that sort of becoming that kind of person and taking particular actions, right? So you could say like, oh, I'm an honest person, but I tell a lie, and that doesn't affect the fact that I'm generally an honest person for some, something or another. That's a bit of a bad argument. But,
Oh, wait, is it so? Virtue ethics is like deontology in on average in statistics, because this is the same. Well, okay, thou shalt not lie. You transfer it. I'm an honest person. That gives you a probability of lying instead of like never, right?
Something like that, yeah. I think, generally, I think the idea is that if you are like a virtuous person, you wouldn't do those bad things ever. Like the probability distribution would hopefully be a direct delta, that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, it suffers from some of the same problems that deontology does. There's like a bit of a subtle difference between what virtue ethics is doing, right? So virtue ethics is not about particular actions that are right and wrong. So deontology is about particular like things that you can and can't do. So like murder wrong in deontology versus virtue ethics would be like you'd be like, I am peaceful or I am considerate, and so therefore because I am peaceful, I will not commit violence against my fellow human beings, something like that. So that's just a slight subtle difference, and but often the actual kinds of decisions that you're making might be quite similar. Another very familiar framework that's when you're talking about the Constitution and the Founding Fathers, this framework of ethics, which originated with John Locke, was very popular among them, and is actually, I think, what a lot of people see as informing a lot of contemporary constitutional law and that kind of thing, which is the idea that human beings, or as some people have extended it beyond human beings to non-human animals and that kind of thing, just by nature of being humans or by being alive or whatever, have certain inalienable rights. So that's right in the literature of the United States. And there are particular rights that are enumerated. The right to preserve dignity, preserve certain kinds of freedoms, and that kind of things. We have a Bill of Rights here in the U.S. that enumerates a particular list of rights that some people decided, back in the 18th century. There are examples of positive rights, like you have a right to something like an education, a right to food, that kind of thing. And there are negative rights like that keep people from infringing on you. So a right to privacy keeps people from knowing particular things about you. Very popular in European discourse recently, and in some of the EU's legislation around data and right to be forgotten, I think is the terminology. Again, rights-based ethics, and any of these things where you're sort of enumerating and listing things which you have to sort of adhere to, require that a lot of these suffer from the problem of it's not clear who is in charge of saying what counts as a right and what does not. Right, that's a big issue that a lot of people bring up against these kind of more classical frameworks. So even with the founding fathers of the U.S., these were all white male property owners who had an idea of inalienable rights, but then of course these rights in practice didn't apply to a lot of people in the early 18th century. So you see this kind of uneven application of things, and even what counts as a right may inform particular kinds of discrimination if one is not careful about it. But still, I think talking about rights is extremely popular. But what's happened more in our contemporary ethical discourse is that people have really taken the question of what it means to be human, saying that So really, like these rights are fine. It's not the question of what the list of rights is. That's fine, but really we have to be equally applying these to everyone. We have to be consistent about it, and that's what a lot of rights-based ethicists are doing right now. Is they're saying, well, the problem isn't that rights-based ethics is wrong; it's that people apply it sort of uh, inconsistently by dehumanizing particular groups of people and doing that kind of thing. So there's a interesting discourse that's happening around rights-based ethics right now. But you see it a lot in the language around right to privacy, right to be forgotten, that kind of thing. Very popular around the AI discourse as well. And then there is a sort of infamous ethical relativism. So I think ethical, and which how you often hear it described as moral relativism, is a bit of a boogeyman. People say like, it just makes no sense. People say like, oh, you're only making decisions based on how you emotionally feel at the time. That's really that's a misunderstanding of what ethical relativism is writ large. There are really radical forms of ethical relativism that are essentially ethical nihilism, which is just everything is meaningless. I make up my own meaning, and I can like decide to shoot someone and say that's right, and no one can tell me otherwise. That's a very extreme viewpoint, and very few actual philosophers advocate for that kind of framework. What you tend to see in ethical relativism that I think is more tenable is that ethical systems are created within societies, and they're created by groups of individuals. We as humans have this idea that we ought to think about what we're doing and its implications and what is right and what is wrong, and so therefore it's a socially constructed kind of thing. It's not that it's completely relative between me and you, but we enter into contracts and societies and build up frameworks over history and over time, in terms of what counts as right and wrong. And that's why you see differences within cultures and that kind of thing. And how you often see is that there's one of the criticisms levied against even this kind of framework, though, is that people often say that ethical relativism is implicitly advocating for tolerance, and that universal tolerance is sort of inherent in relativism because you're acknowledging that all of these different frameworks can emerge. I think that that's not really a good argument, because even that tolerance of other societies is built up in that relative ethical framework. So it's still not a universal. You could still be an ethical relativist and say it's not necessary that all of these relativistic ethical societies be tolerant or believe that tolerance is a universal good. So I spelled something wrong, but yeah, people bring up the problems of inability to condemn particular wrongdoing as a particular thing. So someone could come into a society and say, "Oh, I attacked someone, and it's okay in my culture to attack someone." That's again a boogeyman example. Very few people actually do that. But there is this problem, right? There's a tension when you have differing ethical systems. You have to resolve disagreements between those systems, and there's this problem if you have like a system which is belongs to a particular group that has a lot of social power or something like that. You can tend to have dominance of a particular ethical system, that kind of thing. Yeah, so that's ethical relativism. Again, it's I think often misconstrued as a really radical form of moral relativism, and it's not usually that. People are usually just saying, well, it's we create ethics within societies, and we have to do our best to try to bridge the gaps insofar as ethics is a human created thing. Right? Any questions or thoughts about ethical relativism?
Seems like it's the only one that doesn't depend on other people.
It doesn't depend on other people?
Certain rules, like what is harmful. One authority that decides what is harmful.
Right. So it is by definition, it is distributed, right? So there's not so the issue with a lot of these other frameworks is that they're trying to find what are called universal goods and bads. And this has been the ethical project throughout much of history. And it's what religion tries to do historically as well. As of course, you're asking the deity in that case for what is good and bad. But a lot of these philosophers historically, people like Aristotle and Plato, of course, thought that they were getting at universal truths. And so there's like a bit of a question of, if you think if it's even possible for people to get at any kind of universal truth and that kind of thing, you're getting into, metaphysical questions almost. But yeah, I mean, relativism, just like a lot of forms of like social construction that you see in and constructivism that you see in literature is by definition decentralized. So there is not just a single uh, authority, except for the one that's saying that ethics is relative, right? And that's what's called the performative contradiction, where you have any kind of statement where you said like truth is relative or something like that. Even that statement is relative, and so therefore cannot be universally true. It's a hard problem. A lot of these philosophers tend to say, well, that's just impossible to avoid by the nature of how truth works and how we as humans think about truth and that kind of thing. So very interesting, I think, discussions. I think ethical relativism is given a lot of heat unnecessarily, and I think a lot of people in the social sciences and humanities are giving it a little bit more credit. But again, you have to be wary because it has a lot of criticisms against it as well, which are well put. Okay, so let's talk about some issues that are salient. So from this paper, I just enumerated the issues that this guy brings up for neuroimaging. I found, reading through this paper, that a lot of the concerns that were brought up were general for healthcare, I think, and not so neuroimaging specific. So I've enumerated what he goes through, and then I brought up some stuff that's more relevant, I think, to neuroimaging in particular, a couple issues. And then I want to bring up a discussion. And again, throughout all these frameworks, if it sounds like I'm like advocating for ethical relativism or deontology or anything, I'm not advocating for any of these. It's just like it's to get you thinking about why am I thinking that this is good or wrong? Like, am I or right or wrong? Am I basing it off an authority figure who has told me that throughout my life? Am I basing it off myself? Am I basing it off the society that I live in entirely? Am I following a religious code? And I'm not going to say what is the right answer here. I don't think there actually is a right answer here. I think philosophy, if it gives you if the philosophical pursuit of any field says that this is the right answer to that definitively, then you've done philosophy kind of poorly, in my opinion. And what one should do is look at all the frameworks, compare them, contrast them, think about their implications and what kind of fits best and what works. So thinking about bias. So very important problem. So this is a really nice, I think, depiction of how bias can flow throughout the modeling process here. So you have existing biases of inequality and discrimination in our world that just exist, and those can trickle into how we collect particular data. So if you think about, so there's a very salient issue in EEG. Right, with the caps historically that were using gel, and that they did not fit on too tight curly wound hair. Of course, people of African descent tend to have tighter curly hair, and so you end up with EEG data sets that don't represent your population very well because people don't the caps are not actually fitting to their heads correctly. So that's a very mechanical issue. But there are the issues very salient just in most studies being conducted at universities. And a lot of samples tend to be overrepresentative of younger, often more affluent populations because you're collecting from your student population. I mean, this is a very well-known problem in data. So we have these sampling biases that we're aware of. And I think we all agree that that's something that we want to be aware of. There are a lot of ways to mitigate it. Collecting more data, of course, is the best one to do. But how the data is itself biased can also inform the design of our models. So I think thinking about what kinds of scientific questions the model is being asked to answer is an important question to think about, and how that might potentially be biased in one direction or another. So thinking about how the implications of scientific questions and reinforcing a particular societal bias is one that's very important to do. There have been a lot of studies that have been criticized throughout history for reinforcing negative gender stereotypes and racial stereotypes and stuff like that. I mean, if you look at the history of science, there are some really bad cases there. But yeah, I think, and of course, when you build sort of these implications into your model, when you're either asking bad questions or you're not you're excluding people from your design. You are then when the model becomes applied and used, you are going to reinforce biases that already exist and create. The problem is just going to become worse. So it's one thing to be extremely aware of, Does anyone have any sort of thoughts about bias in models of data and stuff and stuff they want to contribute to this? Yeah, Jordan.
Sure. It almost sounds like a I cannot say that word. How do we know what we know? What is that branch called? Epistemological?
Epistemology.
Thank you. It's that. It sounds like more of a data question more than ethics, though, because there's not really. It's how are we actually getting an accurate sample and how do we know what we know as opposed to what we ought to do. So I'm just kind of curious how it's an ethical question.
So maybe you're saying what you're saying is there is like a question just about like the ability of acquiring knowledge, right? So certainly model bias and bias in data does limit the potential of actual knowledge gain from a study, and that's a very salient issue. The ethical issue is just that one ought to consider the implications of reinforcing particular biases, right, with the study that one is conducting, I think. And so that's where the ethical issue comes into play. I think everyone here agrees that this is something we ought to be aware of and think about. Yeah, I think that's where the ethics comes in. I'm trying to think of where there's another.
Are there any ethical philosophers who base their ethics on sophist philosophy? Then that's a question I have.
I'm sure.
I can't think of any, but I mean that would probably be a good solution.
So, what do you mean that they're basing it off sophism? I'm like, what's your
like because I get a little mixed up. Sophism is the one that we think that we don't think that matter exists, or is that's the one that absolutely matter exists? I always get that one mixed up.
So the sophists were. I'm just making sure I'm right here.
Sorry.
Yeah, I don't. What exactly about sophism? So what are you
Well,
getting at?
it's based on
Because the sophists were like contemporaries of Plato, who did. I don't know particulars about sophist metaphysical beliefs that
if we're building ethics on top of something that we don't actually know for certain and it's agnostic, then shouldn't the properties be transferable? That's my point, I guess. I'm trying to understand. So if we don't actually know if we're actually measuring the actual correct thing and we're making decisions based on that uncertainty, shouldn't the properties be transferable? That's what I'm trying to.
What properties be transferable?
That we're making ethics based on bias models. That makes sense.
I still am not really following the question. Maybe can someone really interpret what you're asking?
Can we move on and then we come back to it?
Yeah, maybe we can come back to it. Another salient issue that this fellow brings up is about data privacy and governance. The idea being that as researchers, we are responsible to make sure that when participants engage with our studies, that their data does not become widely available to their family, to their insurance company, that kind of thing. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about privacy. Do you think? So there's a lot of questions that come up about privacy. What do you all think are salient for work in machine learning? So I'll bring up maybe one particular issue. So there was so of course we have this CoinStat or Neuroplane project now, where we are implementing federated learning so that samples don't have to be transferred between sites in order to train machine learning models, and that at least prevents people from obtaining samples between sites. And so this is the idea is that you're preserving the privacy of the full scan. You're of course still able to make inferences with that data. And then there's a further concern then that there have been a lot of papers talking about sort of reverse engineering attacks on models, where you can take a black box model and you can retrieve samples from the data set and sometimes even attribute them to a particular individual if they're from a rare patient population. So we deal with like Huntington's disease, which is a very rare patient population. If you figure out where the study is being conducted, you know people have Huntington's disease, it becomes very easy to de-identify these people. So yeah, what are some questions that people, or some issues that people have thought about maybe in your own work with respect to data privacy and governance?
Well, I guess this isn't really like work that I've done, but I always kind of think about like the precedents that happen like with data collected by companies. For example, like Apple Watch collects a lot of like biometrics data.
Right.
And like I've actually seen some cases where like people were convicted of crimes using their own biometrics data. And I don't know. I think it would be like if we knew somebody committed a crime, like would it be wrong to try to convict that person of that crime if we have their brain data of some kind? If it was collected commercially, with like using the Neuralink or something like that. Like, would that be okay to do? Because in one case, we're actually convicting the person of some evil crime, but on the other hand, this person has no right to resist incriminating themselves. So I don't know. I kind of think about that. It seems kind of wrong, especially when it's collected commercially and sold.
Right.
Another kind of example of that is like when the 23andMe company, this is a company that tests people for like DNA, where they came from and things like that.
Right.
But actually, this company got bought. The
Right.
company went bankrupt, and now it's just being sold to the highest bidder.
Right.
Actual DNA.
Right.
So I don't know. What do you guys think about that? Should that be an option?
Yeah, so I think that the first issue you bring up is really salient, right? So it has to do with sort of if I agree to participate in a study, how can my data be used, right? So that is a very very big problem in governance. So often with these study agreements, there are very strict rules about like what we are and are not allowed to do. Relatively strict rules, but we are and are not allowed to do with that data. When it comes to companies, you have like often a little bit less of a clear cut, what is right and wrong for them to do. And people have like made that argument, like they are self-incriminating, without their knowledge. They did not agree to have this collected, or maybe they agreed under false pretenses, or the EULA was too long for them to read, and they just kind of scrolled through it, and maybe it doesn't actually represent consenting to this kind of data, like huge data release, that kind of thing. There's a lot
If
of
you agree to like consenting to like give up your amendment rights, like that's
Yeah.
I don't know if that's okay.
Yes, I mean, what do people think?
Another thing that's kind of in that realm, but I was at the psychological conference a couple weeks ago, and there were a lot of like younger undergraduate students who were like thinking about what kind of studies they could do with neuroimaging, and a lot of them were interested. Well, we want to study like serial killer or pedophiles' brain scans and see if we can find any patterns, so we can identify these people ahead of time. And I think that raises a big concern of like what are you? I mean, if you're going to identify them, are we going to start?
Yeah,
Like,
so I
actively,
yeah,
like blaming these people or capturing them or like convicting them of stuff. I mean, that's
what's the movie with Tom
Minority Report.
Cruise?
Minority Report.
Minority Report.
Sorry.
Exactly, where you predict that people will commit crimes based on, and there was a. So I don't know if we want to record this part, but there have been studies. I'll just say this, which predict recidivism rates and jail and prison populations, which is something prisons are very very interested in, because they want to know, like, we want to reduce recidivism. It's the good argument. You don't want people to come back into the jail system. But if you're you're predicting this, and the good world is that you're creating social programs where these people are better supported and they won't receive as much. But when you're predicting recidivism, it's a little bit of a sticky wicket, right? You're like does that imply that you're going to treat these more likely to receive, because you're treating them as if they're already going to receive? You're not giving them a chance to not come back into the prison system, that kind of thing.
Well, so then we get back to that discussion of the issue with Kant and everything with free will versus determinism, and that's ultimately where I always find myself in ethics.
And I also want to tell about other aspect So everyone now uses ChatGPT, for example.
Sure.
And when you ask ChatGPT, maybe you try, what do you know about me? So ChatGPT know about my name, where I work, know what I study, what I'm interested in, what is like you have broad interest in this.
Right.
And I was wondering how many information, much information ChatGPT knows about me, and I asked him, "Is this information private?" Yes, this is private. Could you forget? You forget the information about me. Yes, don't worry. I forgot all information about you. But then I asked him, okay, could you also retrieve information about me? And what do you know about me? And the ChatGPT tell me all. Yes, the same information. So
Yeah. So that's a very problematic issue.
I asked, delete, but retrieve all my now retrieves all the information. So
So yeah, I mean it's a very big issue, and what a lot of these companies are saying in response to that is so that they're like ChatGPT. A lot of these models are trained on open data sets, which is like the internet and stuff that was pulled clear text from the internet. So I have a website, I have a GitHub, I have social media and stuff. And so they claim that by participating in these online spaces, you are tacitly agreeing to have your data be collected and stored in these models. Of course, I disagree with that, but that's what the companies are often arguing. Is that you go through the EULA, Facebook's EULA says this data may be used for X, Y, and Z study, and then Facebook can then use that to build whatever huge models that they want. And that's people aren't often aware. I signed my Facebook end of user license agreement 20 years ago. Like it changes, and what Facebook is doing with that data has changed so radically throughout its history. It's a bit problematic of an argument to make, but that's often what they will say in response.
So we have a civil liberty to our data. Is that a civil liberty then?
In Europe, it is there is the right to privacy and right to be forgotten. Is being very strictly enforced, and a lot of the companies, like Facebook and Google, who are sort of given free rein here in the U.S., are having a lot of trouble over in Europe because of those problems. Yeah.
But regarding ChatGPT, if you turn off the memory, it wouldn't have that much information about you because it was like a few months ago. It was like a trend thing that you ask ChatGPT to give a picture of you based on the information it has. Yeah. So everyone created the same thing. I asked my ChatGPT to it is worth mentioning that I turned off my memory. So I asked ChatGPT to give me an information, and ChatGPT was like, I do not have any information about you. So he couldn't create a picture for me.
Right. Yeah, let's move on though. This is a really great discussion and the kind of discussions I wanted to have, but there's a lot of other issues to cover. So we only have about 10 minutes left. So I want to kind of blaze through some of these. So another thing that this guy brings up with the paper is the potential for the models that we're building in automated healthcare to have adverse effects on the healthcare industry, right? So this is a big concern with a lot of people, especially even in programming, as there are very good models that can program very quickly and maybe not better than me, but faster than me for sure. It's going to have real impacts on the workforce. So people who are in healthcare are concerned, are you going to be putting nurses, doctors out of jobs? Do you think this is something we ought to be considering in our work, or do you think the argument you'll see kind of negatively against this being an issue is that people say, well, that's just the nature of technology, and as technology grows, jobs get lost, and it'd be good if you had some kind of social structure to help soften the blow on these people, but that's just part of the nature of technological advancement, is that some jobs change and get lost.
In terms of I'm a one.
I think it's inevitable that things will change.
Right.
It's just as jobs are destroyed, more jobs are created in some other respect. It's just a change that people have to deal with.
What do people think about this? Agree? Disagree?
Well, the problem that we always been changing, but it's just changing too fast right now for our human brains. The evolution is behind. We can't evolve that fast, but even psychology.
So just another thing to think about. Let's move on. This guy doesn't bring this up, and I thought this was a pretty big omission from this paper. It's not really specific to healthcare, but it's being brought up a lot about the large language models in particular because they're so resource heavy, and you've now Trump is talking about building these large AI warehouses and stuff that are going to have huge environmental footprint. I think it's something to be at least aware of. What are the material effects of what we're having on the world around us? The CPU isn't just a magic crystal that is powered by electricity that comes out of the ether. It's powered by fossil fuels in our current society, and you have to be aware of that. With these huge models with huge GPUs, what are some ways that we can work towards uh, you know bringing in environmental impact into our work? I think some people like Riyasat's work and stuff with mesh now, you reduce your parameter sizes and you reduce your model size, I think are hugely salient to answering these kinds of questions. I think, reducing the footprint of the model is one way to do it. Of course, advocating for, more green energy powering these AI warehouses as well is something that we can advocate for. What do people think about this issue? Do you think, again, we just have to kind of, it's a necessary harm, and eventually we'll figure out the kind of the best way to deal with it. We just have to ignore it. That's kind of what some of this, I think, companies. It's as if it's how they kind of act, right? Is they just kind of do and do and do and like, okay, we'll deal with that problem down the road, kick the can down the road as better technology evolves. What do people think about this?
I guess like when they're incentivized to do it, tackle this, they will do it.
Sure.
Maybe after what DeepSeek did, some people did bring up like it's just like that. Maybe we can get the same amount of work done with it. Just because they have like too much resources, they'll just tend to use it.
Right, right.
Maybe like man hours are better spent on scaling it up instead of trying to optimize for the resource.
Right, right. So something to think about.
Yeah.
I mean, this is, I think, a very obvious issue in science. It's again from an epistemological standpoint. We don't know if the knowledge we're actually gaining from these studies is useful, unless people are able to replicate it. But it does have an ethical issue as well. I think we, as researchers, can agree that there's a responsibility to try to, make sure that our results have the greatest epistemological impact and therefore are replicable. Otherwise, if you have technologies that are not replicable and get, applied, you're going to get spurious results. You're going to get people, with diagnoses that are false. You're going to have a lot of real harm. So another potential ethical thing to think about is, is it our responsibility to create research that is replicable? Not just from a knowledge gaining standpoint, but also from a responsibility to the outcomes of what these models are creating and the harms that it can create, that kind of thing. So let's think about some issues relevant to neuroscience. So I don't know, like this is just like a thought that I had, which is that we work a lot here at the lab with various kinds of mental disorders, schizophrenia, major depression, bipolar disorder, that kind of thing. And there is a lot of stigma, at least in our society in America, against certain kinds of mental illness, and the potential for causing distress if you have like an automated model that just pops up and says you have 99% chance of schizophrenia when you're an adult. Like, what are some ways that we can maybe work with current societal stigmas with against mental health, and how can we be aware of that in our research and maybe be careful of not reinforcing particular stigmas? So there are, one potential danger I think about a lot is with schizophrenia and particular behavioral measures, right? So maybe cognitive measures. Is there's like a potential to there are real cognitive like motor effects to schizophrenia. That's just how the brain is working, but we potentially have to be careful about what kind of questions we're asking. It's like are we reinforcing an existing stereotype about schizophrenia, which schizophrenic people actually don't experience, at writ large. There's a lot of work from people experiencing schizophrenia to say, like, I have my meds, I can live a very normal life. It's not as stigmatized. I'm not, maybe looking for a cure necessarily. Some people will, say. So what do people kind of think about that kind of thing? And some of these thoughts.
You should probably have the people who, actually have these disorders take part in designing the experiments somewhat.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Yeah. And I think it just makes sense to. I mean, we're working in a field which is heavily stigmatized. I think engaging with that stigma and maybe pushing back against it, and becoming advocates for the patients that we're ostensibly trying to help, I think is very clear responsibility, at least for me. That if we can try to, reduce the negative impacts of, that when someone sees that they have schizophrenia all of a sudden, or that they might get schizophrenia when they're like my age or something like that, like they have all these negative thoughts that might come up, and they might not want to tell their family, and then it becomes a huge problem. And like if we can work to lower that stigma, then it becomes, yes, you might, have this risk of schizophrenia. It's a disease, and here we'll try to treat it. It's not like stigmatized. I think that's a very sensible kind of way to deal with stigma in our societies, in the kind of questions that we're asking about, is to try to reduce it, and of course bring the people who are affected by it to the forefront of the conversation, make their voices heard. I think it's extremely important. So we talked a little bit about this, about prediction of actions and mental states. So yeah, I think you have this question not only so there's a scientific question: is it possible to predict what someone will do in the next second by looking at the functional connectivity in their brain? Maybe it is possible. Why are we doing that? Is it who is going to get that prediction, and what are they going to do with it? There are a lot of questions that one should ask, I think, when we're thinking about predicting actions, predicting mental states, that kind of thing. What do people think about some issues around prediction of action, mental states? Again, whether or not you believe in free will, like it doesn't have to. You could believe in free will and still say, like, there's an ethical question, or you could not believe in free will. You could say there's an ethical question of giving the ability to predict my next action to a large company, or to even a well-meaning scientist, that kind of thing. Because even if we don't have free will, I think we can agree that reality is complex enough to become difficult to determine, or to predict, at least with human action. Of course, I say that, and then someone like Newton comes and predicts the tides and predicts the cosmos and all that. Maybe we can do that with human behavior as well. But are there potential things to be worried about as we're doing that?
I think it would matter the level of certainty in a prediction. I think that would, maybe if we're talking the philosophy or the neuroimaging, I think it would matter how certain how accurate our prediction would be. So if the misclassification error is low enough, I think the problem would be then how low. But I think that would be the only argument I could see for utilitarian ethics to be applied. But otherwise, yeah.
So let me ask a bit of an instigating question here. Suppose you have a student who comes to you and they say, like, look, I've got this great data set, it's a task-based data set. My problem is I want to be able to predict, based on someone's functional state before the task, how good they're going to do on the task. And that's what they're going to do. It's very mechanistic, very clear. Like they're only looking at the efficacy on this task, but they are predicting the next action. And what would you say to the student just about whether or not they ought to pursue this project? Do you think it's just because it's interesting from a scientific perspective, in terms of the mechanisms of the mental state, how that affects the person's motor ability, that kind of thing? What do you think?
I would say double check it.
Double check it. Always, a good idea.
That's what I would probably do in that situation,
right,
just to make sure. So.
Right.
Even the like ball efficiency test.
Yeah. I'm not yeah.
No, but yeah, that doesn't sound the problem.
Well, so I guess the way to kind of put it a little bit more bluntly is: ought we predict human actions at all? Is it something that we should do?
We always predict. That's how we function as a society, by predicting each other's actions and by trusting on our predictions. Like, when if you say develop schizophrenia, and you start doing random actions, you become unpredictable to me and to anyone, and that's it. There is no that's why you cannot function, or like the person cannot function in our society, because precisely they're not following some kind of a pattern that we expect to be followed. We think of ourselves as we're unique and blah blah blah, but we're not that unique. Otherwise, it wouldn't function. Like we have to be predictable to work together. I have to rely on Lord to be 20 minutes late and come into the meeting. So I know you'll come. Yeah.
Oh, poor Lord.
Should we stop science at some point so we can prevent it from being weaponized by
Ignorance is not power.
But
Yeah, well,
but then at that point, that you're sacrificing understandability for it, and that line is drawn in the sand. So
Right, so that's the question, and like, yeah, do we stop technological and scientific advancement with the worry that it could be weaponized or used to cause some harm, right? So there's that. That's a big question at work here. Ask, Oppenheimer what he thinks.
Yes.
And
I'm just gonna say that. It's
Right.
like I think we made a mistake not allowing patents for nuclear engineering. I think we don't know what could have happened, and so there's the idea that it's like what 80% accuracy, but there's also 20% of not. And I just think it's not being empirical. It's not looking at the counterfactual argument as opposed to that's why I think it really depends on the choice I would make based on how accurate you think you can predict it. But yeah, sorry to think about patents. But no, I think
I think I think we've settled on. I don't think there's a good answer to the kind of tension that Armin has brought up because they're right. I think we all here are interested in doing good. We're all like interested in mental health and or like
don't be so sure, Brad.
yeah, I mean, you're like, but like I think we at least I love working at this lab and in neuroimaging because I've got computational skills and it's cool to know that I have potential of improving someone's well-being in their life. Right, that's the goal.
It's your virtual ethics, right?
Not even something that like has real like good that it could create in the world, and I think but you never know, right? If you create a model that is able to predict whether or not someone's going to, have a panic attack or something like that, you don't know how that could be misused. There's a big controversy in Florida in mental health around what's actually called the Baker Act. I hate that it's named after it. But it is, yeah, it is where if someone is experiencing significant enough mental distress, the idea is that they are a harm to themselves or others, or they are a risk to themselves or others, you are allowed to call the police on them. The police can come and arrest them and bring them to like a mental hospital against their will, right? So it's a very controversial act that's allowed in Florida, and the idea is right, like if you can predict, like if someone is going to be like extremely suicidal in the next 10 minutes, do you bring the police and come and arrest them and put them in a mental institution? Even if it's going to be 10 minutes in the future, like, or do you give them the ability to like they commit that act and then you have to work to try to prevent it? Or
so let me I don't know, we're out of time, and if you're very easy, then thanks for coming over. I really appreciate it. Then you can go back. I think the discussion is interesting.
Yeah.
So there is a certain kinds of epilepsy that people put implants that can detect the onset of this discharge, massive discharge, and depolarize it as it happening.
Yeah.
It's exactly this thing.
Yeah.
Only not in a neurological disorder rather than mental,
Yeah.
but exactly that.
Yeah.
It's already there and it's helping a lot of people.
Yeah.
So it is similar. So take this device. I saw its image. I don't know if it's put in between hemispheres or stuff. It's kind of huge. Like in one of the projects that we're doing. So imagine this epilepsy stuff, neurological disorder. It's mechanical, like a broken arm, or like exactly what's going on. Imagine that instead of that device, we call the police. They come because we know that the person will have a seizure. They stand there and they're ready. And like when the person has seizure, so why not do that to mental disorders if we establish that we can catch and not prevent, if we don't know yet how to prevent it, like with epilepsy seizure, it's kind of like preventative, but it's not cure. It's just depolarizing the electrical currents. If we're there and the person starts having mental breakdown or something, like I don't know, like there could be psychotic episodes and stuff, and we're there, we're wrapping them in a blanket. They don't hurt themselves. We're like, okay, it's over. Like, why not?
Yeah, I think at least my part of the discussion is it's important to think about how that is handled and how the society in which that will be implemented will handle it, right? So I would not give it to the Orlando Police Department, for example.
Well, that's a trust issue, right? Because we don't trust each other that much. For whatever reason, we don't pay policemen enough, so good people don't come there. I don't know. It's a long conversation, but
it is a long.
For Armina, for the thin line, I think we like one of the things is predicting, another thing is learning about the system. When you
Right.
blindly just keep building classifiers,
Right.
that's another pet peeve of mine,
Right.
then what are you learning? But if we learn something about the brain, maybe we can handle it better, maybe we can cure it. Like we can know the mechanism and then develop cures. And if we just put our hands in the sand, just near that line that you drew, then that's it. There is no, I think this is not like,
But the point, I think that the point that Brad and Amir are trying to make is that, well, if we know and then we can predict and then we know exactly how to cure it, then we can infuse somebody, we can infuse an episode to somebody. Somebody else could do that, right? And that's not what you intend to make it to do. You probably intend to cure the disorder, but somebody could infuse the disorder.
Right, yeah, exactly. So you tell
Because we
someone like,
understand it.
oh, it looks like you're gonna be like have a suicidal ideation in the next 5 minutes.
Right.
You weren't thinking about that. All of a sudden,
You just
oh
start
yeah,
thinking
oh my God, yeah, I do like it. Like I
and
think,
then you
yeah,
just misuse
yeah.
that.
I don't buy this argument that like I don't. It doesn't prove me that knowledge is bad. There are so many times. So I think it's the same argument. AI is going to be smart and it's going to kill us. Like, well, because it will start producing paperclips. Well, you said smart, and then you're saying stupid. Like, we will learn to handle it. It's like it's like if we don't know, we don't know what we need to handle.
Yes, but other people who have different motives than
You don't trust other people.
Yeah, well, yes,
that's the point.
that's the point.
Yeah,
And the issue is that that's the case.
But that's a different issue. It's a trust issue and society issue. It's not the issue of knowledge.
No. I don't think. I think it's not because I mean I think good luck to anybody who's trying to stop science from doing it. I mean they're gonna. I mean I don't think that somebody can tell me that well I'm trying to do this and don't do it because it might be harmful and I'll
Some
stop.
experiments
I
are
don't think I
actually-
can stop
Some
if
experiments
I
are
think it's
inhumane.
interesting.
Some experiments are inhumane. Maybe we should.
No, but we did impose rules on those.
Like stem cells.
So it's.
And I think we should. I think there are some questions about AI experiments as well that have to be like maybe not ruled out, but we have to ask the same questions about that we did about like lobotomies and these kinds of procedures and experimentation. Like it's like of course our knowledge and our ethics change as well. I think historically, so there's not a definitive answer, but I think it's and to wrap a bow on this discussion, the point is to engage you all in this conversation and to give you some directions to look for tools to start asking ethical questions about your work if you haven't already. I think we all are, and I think it's important as people working at the intersection of AI and neuroimaging to really be aware of these discussions and to participate in them and to listen, of course, to people who are impacted by our work and think about all of these things. So thank you guys for the time, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Brad.